the first thing you need to do is enable Hyper-V because it's disabled by default. And this is an 8.1 Pro system. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the control panel, Programs and Features, and turn Windows features on or off. And here we see Hyper-V. And if we hit the plus sign, you'll see we have Hyper-V Management Tools, and you see Hyper-V Platform is grayed out. And the reason is because virtualization support is disabled in the firmware. And so that needs to be turned on in the BIOS or UEFI before we can actually use this. So we'll go ahead and make that change in the UEFI so that we can use the Hyper-V platform. Okay, so we're in the BIOS of the AV Editor computer, and this is the ASUS UEFI BIOS utility. We've shown this previously in the 901 course, and here we are again. We need to enable Intel virtualization. So we're going to go to Advanced Mode, down here on the bottom right. We'll go to Advanced, and we want CPU configuration, so we'll click on that, and we'll scroll down to Intel virtualization technology, and you can see it's disabled. And on some motherboards, it is disabled by default. So I'm going to click on that, enable it, and we're going to exit out of here and save the changes and reset the system. And it tells you the change you made. Intel virtualization technology went from disabled to enabled. And that's what we want so that we can run Hyper-V properly, the Hyper-V platform. So click OK. That'll reboot the system. And we'll jump back over to Windows and install Hyper-V. So we booted back into Windows. We're in the control panel. Go back to Programs and Features. Turn Windows features on or off. Hyper-V. Hit the plus sign for that. And you'll see that this is no longer grayed out. Hyper-V platform. We're good to go because we enabled it in the BIOS. Now, in some cases, you have to enable those separate extensions, all those VT extensions. But with our ASUS BIOS and a lot of the new UEFI systems, you just enable virtualization, and they make it easy for you. And then the Hyper-V platform is enabled. So we got it. We're going to click OK and go through the installation for that and restart the system. Okay, so Windows 8 restarted a couple times. And now we're back in the system. I remoted into the computer here, and we're going to go to our Hyper-V manager. So we're going to go to the control panel and administrative tools. And, you know, I go to administrative tools a lot, and so quite often I'll right-click this and pin it to start so that's here permanently. So click that now, and you'll see we have the Hyper-V manager here, and double-click that to open him up. Okay, and it says no virtual machines were found. That's because I haven't created any yet. The great thing about this program is you can work with multiple computers. You can connect to other systems that also have Hyper-V running and create virtual machines on any of those systems. Now, before you do create a new virtual machine, you're going to want to have a networking connection. By default, you won't have a networking connection out to the physical network. You'll have networking connections to other virtual machines, but not to the physical network. So if you want that, and chances are you will for what you're doing if you're doing studying, you want to go to the virtual switch manager and then set up a new virtual switch, and you'll want an external one, and that'll bind the network adapter of this system to the virtual machine. So you can actually get to the physical network, access the internet, and so on. So you may want to create a virtual switch first. Once that's done, you'll go to your computer, AV Editor, in this case, right-click it and go to New and Virtual Machine. That'll bring up the Virtual Machine wizard. We'll click Next. You name it. You select which generation you want. Generation 1 will allow it to work with any versions of Hyper-V. Generation 2 takes additional functionality into account, such as Secure Boot, PXE Boot, and things like that. So I'm going to use Generation 2. But you have to be careful with that because you can't change the generation once you create the system, once you create the virtual machine. So you may want Generation 1 for your purposes. And click Next. You set the memory. You know, we might want 2048 or 2 gig. Click Next. And then you see that virtual machine network adapter setting. It's not connected because we didn't set up the virtual switch yet. Now this gets more into the Microsoft side of things and isn't as important to know exactly step by step for the exam, but you get an idea here. You want to have a networking connection usually. Click Next. Create your virtual disk. In this case, it's a VHDX. And we'll just leave it as a default. Click Next. And we'll say install an operating system later, but you could do this from an image file, from an ISO file, which could be on your hard drive. This way, you really don't have to deal with any disks at all, which is beautiful. And click Finish. That configures that guy, and it shows our new virtual machine, which again, we could call this whatever we want, and we could even change the name now. And then to run this guy, you could double click him and then run him from there, or you could go to Action and go to Start. So this guy's running, and then to see it, we double click on it, and you'll see it here. So you could have it running in the background without actually seeing it on the screen, which is a beautiful thing, especially if you're going to run servers or systems that are storing data or have media files or whatever, databases. This way it runs more in the background. Now remember, this is Hyper-V for Windows 8, so it's running within the OS. It is not a Type 1 hypervisor. If you want a Type 1 bare bones hypervisor, a true to form Type 1, you have to run it on server, and you have to set up the server properly to make that happen. You have to set it up as a Hyper-V system from the get-go when you install server. So that's important. If you want to run a Type 1, it's got to be installed correctly regardless of what software you're using. When you're in Windows 8, Windows 8.1 or newer, you're running it as a Type 2. So let's show a little bit of that. The server side for virtualization is not really that important for the A+ exam. They're concerned with the client side virtualization, but I figured I'd just show this real fast because I have two different types running here. I've got a Windows Server 2012 here, and if we scroll down, we'll see it's an Active Directory domain services box. That means it's a domain controller. It runs DHCP, runs DNS, it's a file server, and it runs Hyper-V. So this is Hyper-V for server. However, this is running as a role, as a service on the server. So you have to differentiate that with the true bare metal Type 1 Hyper-V. So let's take a look at it though. Let's go to Tools, and we'll go down to Hyper-V Manager. And you can see here, it shows pretty much the same type of thing. Here's the name of the computer, and here's the virtual machines that we have in there. Kali, Linux, another Server 2012 that runs virtually, and Windows 7, which is actually running right now. And you know what? That's going to use up a lot of resources. So I'm actually going to turn that off so that it's not using those resources right now. And I mentioned a virtual switch. Here we have our virtual switch manager. If we click on that, you'll see we have a virtual switch right now, which is acting as external network, which means our virtual machines that use this switch can go out to the external network. But we can have multiple switches. We could create another switch, one that's internal, where the virtual machines can communicate with each other and with the host computer, but not outside of that. And then private, where the virtual machines can only communicate with each other. So more security as you go down the line here. And it's pretty cool because you can have multiple virtual switches. All right. So there's an example of Hyper-V running in server. Effectively, it works the same way. A little bit more powerful, a little bit more capability, but effectively the same as one that runs in Windows 7 or 8.1 or Windows 10 or what have you. Now, if we go back to VMware Workstation, just to confuse the issue a little bit more, here is Windows. This is my Windows 10 computer I'm in, and inside that I'm running VMware Workstation, and inside of that we have Hyper-V bare bones. This is the bare bones version. So to get into this, you have to unlock it first and type in the password. 2 windows there. A little tight here, but it's a menu-driven system. It's a menu-driven system, and you'd go through these to work with the system and to create new machines. And you could do it directly within the command line as well. So you get those two windows that are running here, but there's really no GUI to speak of. It's bare bones. That's what you want to run if you want to have a true Type 1 hypervisor, the bare bones version of Hyper-V. And that's separate altogether. In the Server 2012 that I have, this is one of the roles. It's only one of the roles within the server. So you're not going to get nearly the effectiveness in this as you would with a bare bones. Now, of course, this is running as a virtual machine. That's just so I could show it to you, because it's a little tougher to show on an actual system. But this is what you would install to an actual system. And this way you don't have all that overhead of the GUI. And there's an example of a true Type 1 virtualization system. Okay, so a little bit about all kinds of virtualization out there. And a lot of times my go-to tool, VMware Workstation, because I can run all this stuff in there. And really concentrate on the client-side stuff for the A+ exam. That means working with virtual machine software from VMware, also Hyper-V for Windows 7, Windows 8.1, Windows 10, and also VirtualBox. So check those out, practice working with virtualization, and that's about it for this sub-lesson.